What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the channel. It's Ryan, former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown airliners for years on top of that. And today we're doing a deep dive on something that made a lot of headlines a few weeks back. And I want to give you the full, accurate breakdown of it because I've seen this story get pretty distorted and dramatized in some corners of the internet. And I want to walk you through exactly what was actually reported, what wasn't, how credible the sourcing actually is, and what it all means from a security and geopolitical standpoint. So this is the story about Iran, an alleged plot against Trump, and why Air Force One ended up getting swapped out mid-trip. Grab a coffee. This one's going to be a thorough breakdown, and let's get into it. So here's the actual timeline, and I want to walk through this carefully because the sequence of events actually matters a lot for understanding this story correctly. Back in early July, Trump was overseas. He'd been at a NATO summit in Turkey, and from there he traveled to Britain, landing at RAF Mildenhall, which is a Royal Air Force base that also hosts U.S. forces. And instead of flying home from Britain on the newly renovated presidential aircraft, the one that was famously donated by Qatar, a $400 million Boeing 747 that had gotten a lot of attention when it was first gifted, he ended up switching over to the older, existing Air Force One for the flight home. That swap is what kicked this whole story off publicly, because reporters traveling with the president noticed it, started asking questions about why the switch happened, and that's when the intelligence piece behind it started coming out through multiple outlets. According to reporting from the Wall Street Journal, which broke this story, and followed up shortly after by CNN and a bunch of other major outlets, Israel had shared intelligence with the United States, indicating that Iran had developed what officials described as a new plot targeting Trump. Now, I want to be really precise here because the language used across different reports actually varies in a meaningful way, and I think getting that distinction right is the whole key to understanding this story responsibly, rather than just running with the scariest possible headline. Some of the initial reporting characterized this as a specific, detailed plot, with language suggesting real operational planning behind it. Other reporting, notably a follow-up piece from CNN that came out just a day or two after the initial story broke, described the intelligence differently, saying it actually reflected more of a desire among hardline elements within Iran's leadership to go after Trump, rather than a fully fleshed-out operational plan with a specific method and timeline already locked in and ready to execute. That CNN follow-up specifically named Ahmad Vahidi, described as the new commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, as someone who was reportedly part of a group within the Iranian leadership advocating for this kind of operation, according to an Israeli source. So there's a real and meaningful difference between those two versions of the story. One implies an active, developed plot in motion, and the other implies more of an internal push or desire among certain hardline officials, which is a very different threat picture. And I think it's genuinely important not to just pick whichever version sounds more dramatic and run with it, because the actual underlying reporting is more nuanced than either extreme. Now, when you hear a headline like Iran plotted to shoot down Air Force One, I want to walk you through what that would actually mean from a threat perspective, because I think a lot of people don't have real context for how difficult that specific scenario actually is to execute, and also why officials still take even a lower probability version of that broader threat extremely seriously anyway, because those two things aren't contradictory. Air Force One, whichever specific aircraft is being used at a given time, is a heavily defended platform, and I want to break down some of what that actually means in practice, at least at the level of what's publicly known, because a lot of the specific defensive systems are classified. It's got electronic countermeasures on board designed to defeat various types of guided threats. It's got infrared missile warning systems that can detect a missile launch and cue defensive responses. It's escorted by fighter cover, especially in higher threat environments or when transiting contested or potentially hostile airspace. And its flight routing is planned with an enormous amount of operational security, specifically to reduce exposure to any kind of surface-to-air threat in the first place, meaning a huge amount of the actual defense happens before the aircraft even takes off, through careful route planning, timing, and coordination with host nations along the flight path. So when people hear a plot to shoot down Air Force One, I think a lot of folks picture some kind of movie scenario where a missile just comes out of nowhere with no warning and that's the end of the story. And realistically, actually pulling that off against a protected head of state aircraft, especially one flying over friendly or allied airspace like it was on this particular trip from Turkey through to Britain, both NATO countries with their own layered air defense and airspace security, is an extraordinarily difficult thing to actually execute successfully. That doesn't mean the broader threat isn't taken seriously by the people whose job it is to protect the president, and I'll get into why it absolutely is taken seriously in a minute, but I want to set realistic expectations here about how far-fetched the actual mechanics of that most dramatic, specific scenario are compared to other, more plausible threat vectors that security services generally worry about far more. What I think is actually more significant, and more precisely what the underlying reporting actually supports, is that this was treated as a broader assassination threat against the president generally, meaning there were real concerns about his overall security picture, not necessarily a confirmed, technically detailed plan to physically shoot the specific aircraft out of the sky mid-flight on that specific route. And that broader threat picture, the idea of Iran wanting to target Trump specifically, is honestly not new at all. And I think this is a really important piece of context that a lot of the coverage of this specific July story doesn't always connect clearly for people. The reporting specifically ties this back to the January 2020 strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, who was the commander of the IRGC's Quds force, an incredibly significant and powerful figure within Iran's military and security apparatus. That strike was ordered by Trump during his first term, and U.S. officials have warned publicly, consistently for years since then, that Iran has an ongoing and serious interest in retaliating against Trump specifically because of that strike, viewing it as a personal decision by him that deserves a personal response. So this July intelligence wasn't coming out of nowhere in some isolated vacuum. It was described by one source who spoke to CNN as part of, and I want to get the framing right here, a steady drumbeat of intelligence over recent weeks about possible plans to target him, with this particular Israeli warning specifically being new and more concrete or specific than what had come before it in that ongoing stream of threat reporting. Now here's where the story gets genuinely interesting from a political and diplomatic angle, and I think this is actually one of the most important parts of the entire story, because this intelligence sharing wasn't reported as some kind of totally clean, universally accepted, uncomplicated piece of information. Several U.S. officials, according to both the journal's original reporting and CNN's follow-up reporting, raised the real possibility that Israel sharing this specific intelligence at this particular moment in time could have been at least partly intended to influence Trump's decision-making, specifically around whether to escalate U.S. military action against Iran further, at a moment when the ceasefire was already under real strain. And I want to explain the broader context behind why that suspicion existed among some American officials. Because it's not just idle speculation, it's tied to a real and documented rift that had opened up between Washington and Jerusalem around that exact period. At the time this intelligence was shared, in early July, the ceasefire between the U.S. through Israel and Iran was already fraying badly, and it would fully collapse just a few days later on July 7th, when Iran struck commercial vessels that had bypassed an approved shipping route. Prime Minister Netanyahu had reportedly been pushing hard for a more aggressive posture toward Iran throughout this period, wanting to press the advantage and continue military operations, while Trump at that specific point was reportedly more focused on trying to preserve the existing fragile ceasefire arrangement rather than escalate further. So you had this real dynamic playing out behind the scenes where some American officials were essentially saying, look, we can't fully rule out that this warning is genuine and worth taking seriously on its own merits, but we also can't rule out that the timing of sharing it serves Israel's broader strategic interest in pushing Washington toward a harder line at exactly the moment when that push was needed most from Israel's perspective. For what it's worth, and I want to present this fairly because there are two real sides to this particular dispute. The Israeli side pushed back firmly on that interpretation. A spokesperson for the Israeli embassy said publicly that Israel shares intelligence with the U.S. because of the close, long-standing partnership between the two countries, not to advance any kind of hidden agenda like pushing for a return to full-scale war. Prime Minister Netanyahu's office, notably, didn't respond to requests for comment on this specific question, which you can read into however you'd like, but I don't think a non-response should automatically be treated as confirmation of anything either way. There's also an interesting and honestly pretty striking detail about how the broader relationship between Trump and Netanyahu was being described around this same period, which I think adds important color to the whole story. There was reporting of a notably tense phone call between the two leaders around this time, where Trump reportedly described Netanyahu using some pretty pointed language, and broader reporting from multiple outlets described the overall relationship as having cooled significantly compared to earlier phases of the war, when the two of them had reportedly been in extremely frequent, even late-night phone contact as they coordinated the initial strikes back in February. So this assassination intelligence didn't land in some kind of neutral, purely informational vacuum. It landed right in the middle of some very real friction between the two governments over exactly how to handle the next phase of this conflict. And that context matters enormously for how you interpret the timing of when and how this specific warning got shared. Now let's get back to the actual mechanics of the plane switch itself, because I think that's the part people are most curious about, and there's actually more nuance here than most of the coverage captured. According to the New York Times reporting on this specific decision, the choice to fly the older Air Force One rather than the newer Qatari donated aircraft was made at the recommendation of the Secret Service specifically as a security precaution. which tells you the decision came from the professional security apparatus rather than being a purely political call. And there's actually a pretty grounded, non-dramatic technical explanation for at least part of this decision too, separate entirely from the specific new assassination intelligence, that I think deserves more attention than it usually gets in the coverage of this story. Some reporting pointed out that the newer aircraft simply didn't yet have the same level of defensive countermeasure systems installed and fully operational and tested as the older. See, long-serving Air Force One does, because that older aircraft has had literal decades to have its defensive systems matured, tested, upgraded, and hardened against evolving threats. Whereas the newer jet was still relatively early in that whole process of getting fully equipped and certified to the same standard. So part of this decision may honestly have simply been about flying the more proven, more fully equipped aircraft, given the elevated threat environment at that moment, rather than being exclusively and directly a reaction to just this one specific new piece of intelligence. And I think that's a more boring, but probably more accurate way to understand at least part of what happened here. Trump himself, for his part, pushed back pretty directly and pretty publicly on the idea that security concerns specifically drove the swap. He said the newer plane was actually flown to Britain separately from his own travel so that U.S. troops stationed there would get a chance to see it up close, kind of as a morale and visibility thing for personnel stationed overseas. And when reporters asked him directly whether he was aware of a credible Iranian threat against the plane specifically, he didn't really confirm that specific framing. He instead pivoted to a broader comment about facing threats constantly, saying something along the lines of being number one on their list, and that he's been a little lucky so far, but that luck maybe doesn't last forever. So even the president's own public comments ended up blending a general acknowledgement of being a persistent target with a pretty clear pushback against the more specific narrative that this one particular plane swap was a direct, immediate reaction to this one specific new intelligence report that had just come in. I also want to flag, because I think it adds really important context that a lot of coverage of this specific July incident doesn't connect for people, that this actually fits into a broader pattern that predates this specific story by quite a while. There was reporting, including from an upcoming book covering Trump's political rise back to the presidency, describing earlier security concerns going back to his 2024 campaign, about Iranian operatives with access to surface-to-air missile capability reportedly operating inside the United States itself, and that those specific concerns were serious enough at the time that his security team actually had him fly on a decoy aircraft, separate from his usual and recognizable campaign plane, to at least one event during that period. So the broader concept of Iran specifically being viewed as a credible surface-to-air missile threat against Trump's aircraft isn't some brand new idea that popped up out of nowhere. Only in July of this year, there's a longer-running thread of exactly this type of specific concern that stretches back well over a year at this point, tied into the broader post-Soleimani threat picture that's been building for years now. Let me also spend a minute on why intelligence services and Secret Service protective details take even fairly loosely defined threats this seriously, because I think that's worth explaining from more of an operational security mindset rather than just a political one. In protective security work, the standard operating principle is that you don't wait around for perfect, fully corroborated certainty before making a precautionary adjustment, because by the time you have that level of certainty about a specific plot, it's often too late to meaningfully act on it. Instead, the whole discipline of protective intelligence is built around identifying patterns, taking every credible sourced warning seriously enough to at least consider practical mitigations, and layering multiple relatively low-cost precautions on top of each other. Route changes, aircraft changes, adjusted timing, additional escort assets, precisely because any single one of those precautions is relatively cheap and low disruption compared to the catastrophic cost of an actual successful attack. So from that lens, switching which specific aircraft the president flies on, even in response to intelligence that some officials privately considered not fully credible, is a completely rational and, honestly, pretty unremarkable decision within that broader protective security framework. It's not really evidence one way or another about how credible the specific threat actually was. It's just standard risk management practice. So let me give you my honest overall take here as someone who's flown protected, high-value military aircraft, though obviously nothing at the level of Air Force One, specifically in terms of the threat environment or the protective apparatus around it, but I do understand the broader underlying principles of layered defense for a high-value, high-profile target like that. I think the responsible way to read this entire story is that there was a real, credible enough piece of intelligence, shared through a trusted and long-standing allied intelligence relationship, that the U.S. government took seriously enough to adjust its operational planning around, which is genuinely exactly what you'd want a functioning security apparatus to do in this situation. You don't wait around for perfect certainty before making a precautionary adjustment like an aircraft switch. That's a genuinely low-cost move from an operational standpoint, and it's the kind of decision that almost certainly gets made out of an abundance of caution constantly in this world, most of which the public simply never hears about, because it doesn't generate a news story the way a visible noticed plane swap does. At the same time, I think it's completely fair, and honestly necessary for anyone trying to understand this story accurately, to hold two things in your head at the exact same time here. That a genuine security threat can absolutely exist and be taken seriously by professionals, while also acknowledging openly that the specific timing and manner in which intelligence gets shared between even close allied governments can be influenced by each government's own separate strategic interests in a given moment. That's not some kind of wild conspiracy theory. That's genuinely just how intelligence sharing between even the closest of allies actually works in the real world. There's almost always some amount of strategic communication and interest alignment happening alongside the raw underlying information itself. And experienced officials on both sides of any alliance relationship understand that dynamic implicitly. I don't think the evidence, based on everything that's actually been reported across multiple credible outlets at this point, supports the single most dramatic possible version of this headline, meaning a fully developed, operationally ready plot to physically shoot down the aircraft mid-flight with a specific missile system already positioned and a specific launch plan already actively in motion at that moment. What the reporting actually and more carefully supports is a real threat that was taken seriously, but one that was reportedly somewhat less concrete and operationally mature than that most dramatic framing suggests, more accurately aligned with hardline elements within Iran's leadership, including specifically named IRGC leadership according to at least one source, wanting to target Trump, layered directly on top of a well-established multi-year pattern of Iran viewing him as a legitimate target for retaliation because of the Soleimani strike back in January of 2020. That's still a genuinely serious and newsworthy story on its own merits that's still absolutely worth understanding fully and taking seriously. I just think it's worth being precise and careful about what was actually confirmed by credible sourcing versus what gets assumed or embellished on top of it. By the time a story like this reaches a maximally dramatic headline format designed purely to generate clicks. So that's the full detailed breakdown. That's the actual underlying reporting behind the plane swap itself, the intelligence sharing between Israel and the U.S. The real political tension it revealed between Washington and Jerusalem at that specific moment in the conflict, the longer-running historical context tying back to the Soleimani strike, and my honest overall read on how seriously to take each individual piece of this story. Let me know in the comments what you guys think. Do you think this was a legitimate, serious, and fairly concrete threat? Or do you think the specific timing here says more about the state of the U.S.-Israel relationship at that particular moment than it does about an actual imminent, operationally ready plot? I would genuinely love to hear where you guys land on this one, because I think there are reasonable arguments on a few different sides of it. And if you want more breakdowns like this one, where I really try to cut through the sensationalized headline version of a story and get you the actual carefully reported facts, along with the proper context around them, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe. It genuinely helps me keep putting this kind of content out for you guys. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, signing off.